Hello, my name is Brooke, and I am the Early Literacy Librarian in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And today I'm going to share with you 3 things I wish I knew about infant programming before I actually started programming for infants. So my number one tip is that you have to be super flexible. While I've been a librarian for infant story times, I've had just about everything imaginable happen to me. I've had no one show up. I've had 20 people show up with their infants, and they all brought a grandma or a grandpa or an aunt and uncle that day. I've had all of my babies asleep at the same time. I've had babies throw up on me. Just literally about anything you could imagine has probably happened at story time. But flexibility is really key with this age range. I always start out my story times about 10 minutes late, just so parents can feel not rushed when they're coming into the story time room, because babies bring a lot of stuff with them. And we live in Wisconsin, so it's very cold half the year, so lots of coats and mittens and things. But this also encourages parents and caregivers to come to story time, even if they're running late. I always tell them that they're never too late to come to infant story time. And I also think judging the room's mood is very important. If all my babies are crabby that day, we're probably going to spend a lot of time singing, and we might skip the books altogether. Or if everyone's very awake and alert, we might spend a lot of time on the books and really going over the pictures and the details. And if everyone's asleep, which has happened a few times to me, I turn it much more into kind of an open forum for the caregivers and parents, where we end up talking a lot about child development. Sometimes it almost ends up being an adult book club where we just talk about the books we're reading and loving, because we also know that caregivers reading in front of their little ones is very important to build that love of reading at home. So my next tip is play in your infant programs. This is so important because we know babies learn by playing. So when you include playtime in your story times, you are doing such a great service to these parents and caregivers, because it can be awkward and uncomfortable to play with a new baby, especially if it's your first baby, especially when they're in that kind of blobby stage, which is what I call that 0 to 3 month range, where they're not really responsive. It can feel uncomfortable and definitely unnatural. But having the opportunity to role model what play looks like for that age range is so important. And you can show them peekaboo, and you can tell them that just by talking to your baby, you're really helping them develop all these great early literacy skills they'll need later in life. And so it's really a fun thing to do for playtime, and it also gives parents and caregivers time to chat amongst themselves and become lifelong friends. And then my last tip is that it is about the caregivers. I try to keep this in mind for every program we do for early literacy, but especially for those under 1-year-olds. We want our programs to be fun and energetic and entertaining, but it's really about the caregivers. Those are our true audience we're trying to reach, because we have such a wonderful opportunity to role model early literacy skills and to help them build their confidence as a caregiver. So during each story time, I always read a book out loud, like a traditional story time, so face out book, and I edit the text pretty dramatically, just because it can be hard to find a book that's kind of good for infant story time. So I usually edit the text, or I just don't say the text at all and I make up my own. And sometimes we'll just talk about the pictures. And I found that doing this really encourages and kind of gives freedom to our caregivers to choose a variety of books that they normally would avoid. And then we also do a big choral reading as a group. So that's where every single caregiver gets their own board book, and we all read it together. And this is great, because we know that before 4 or 5 months of age, baby's eyesight isn't greatly developed. So it's having that board book close to their face so they can actually see it. But it also promotes that bonding for the caregivers and the infants, because they're having kind of their own personal story time while story time is happening. And I always encourage them to stay on a page if their little one seems to really love it. And I also provide a variety of board books that we do throughout the session. So sometimes we'll do touch and feel or lift the flaps, just to expose the caregivers to the different types of board books that are out there, because it can be very overwhelming to just kind of go to our board book shelves and try to pick a good book that your little one is going to like. And it really depends on the mood of my group. Sometimes I'll read an entire book to the group, like Clip Clop by Nicholas Smee. But there are definitely times where I've also just read like a page or two from a book before calling it good, simply because it's better to just show them good reading than to force down an entire book, I think. So these are my top tips about infant programming. And if you want to see the way I set up my infant story times or kind of the timelines that I use for my story times, feel free to check out my blog. I'll put it down in the description. And yeah, good luck. You guys are going to do wonderful.